Welcome to another deep dive. Today we're going to be looking into a very interesting maritime disaster, the sinking of the steamship Arctic back in 1854. And what we're going to be doing today is we're actually going to be unpacking firsthand accounts from newspapers. So this isn't going to be just a general historical overview. You and I are really going to dig into these sources, uncover some of the details and stories of courage, but also grapple with some of those kind of uncomfortable questions about responsibility that even though this happened so long ago, they still kind of resonate today.
Yeah, one of the really intriguing things about this particular event is the context. So 1854 transatlantic steamship travel is really in its infancy. The Arctic itself was considered, a masterpiece of American engineering, luxurious, fast, the pride of the Collins line. So when it went down, it wasn't just a ship sinking. It was like the symbol of technological advancement meeting a very tragic end and really kind of shook public confidence in the technology.
So let's set the scene a little bit here. The Arctic sets sail from Liverpool, headed to New York, packed with over 400 passengers and crew. And it's a foggy day when suddenly, bam, they collide with a much smaller vessel called the Vesta. And initially, there was actually like a sense of relief because news had spread about another ship sinking the city of Glasgow.
Yeah.
But then that turned out to be false. So everyone's like, okay,
Yeah.
just a minor bump. We'll be fine.
Right. Well, not quite. The Arctic actually sustained some pretty severe damage below the waterline, which, as you know, is kind of the most crucial area when it comes to a ship's buoyancy. And this is where the limitations of communication back in 1854 become critical. It took precious time for the crew to really grasp the full extent of the damage. I mean, they didn't have instant radios or, distress signals like we have today.
So as that kind of gravity of the situation set in, you can imagine the terror on board, right? I mean, as people realized they were in serious trouble. And those newspaper accounts that we have, they paint such a harrowing picture of chaos as the Arctic began to sink rapidly. One of the details that really stuck with me was the lifeboat tackle snapping and, sending women and children plunging into the icy Atlantic.
Yeah, it's just such a stark reminder of the human cost of this disaster.
Yeah.
Those accounts really capture the raw panic, the desperate scramble for the lifeboats, and these acts of self-preservation alongside these incredible acts of heroism as well. It's a really interesting mix. The event itself, though, really forced this reckoning with maritime safety regulations. Because believe it or not, before the Arctic sinking, carrying enough lifeboats for all passengers wasn't actually mandatory.
Wow.
So the disaster really served as this wake-up call, leading to these significant changes in regulations to prioritize safety at sea.
And amidst all that chaos, the actions of Captain Luce became this major point of discussion. He refused to leave the sinking ship, choosing to prioritize the safety of women and children, and ultimately he went down with the Arctic. His decision has been debated for over a century. I mean, what are your thoughts on this?
A good, great question. And Captain Luce's actions really do raise these complex questions about leadership and responsibility. I mean, was he a hero? Was he negligent? Should he have taken like a more active role in organizing the evacuation? The newspaper articles that we're looking at provide kind of conflicting views on this. Some accounts really praise his bravery while others criticize his judgment. It's not an easy answer.
It's so fascinating how even from the primary sources, right, these varying perspectives emerge. And it's not just about Captain Luce's actions either. These sources actually offer conflicting information about the cause of the sinking itself and who was really at fault. Some blame the Vesta for not taking proper evasive action, while others suggest that the Arctic's crew was slow to react. Makes you think about how difficult it can be to piece together a complete and accurate picture of events, especially in the heat of a crisis.
Absolutely. The Arctic disaster really serves as this reminder that even firsthand accounts can be subjective and that multiple perspectives are absolutely crucial for understanding historical events.
So now, shifting gears just a bit, I want to talk about the aftermath. It's so difficult to grasp the sheer scale of this tragedy. Hundreds of lives lost, families shattered, communities in mourning. The newspapers are full of names. Mr. Collins and his family, Mr. Gilbert, Mr. Wolverton. It makes it so painfully clear that these weren't just statistics. These were real people with lives, dreams, and loved ones. And so many of the survivors returned to New York with absolutely nothing, having lost everything in the sinking. It wasn't just the loss of life, it was the financial ruin that accompanied it.
And the aftermath didn't just reveal the fragility of human life at sea. It also exposed these deep social inequalities of the time. Wealthier passengers were sometimes given priority in the lifeboats, and this preferential treatment really ignited public outrage and contributed to ongoing debates about class and privilege debates that are still very much relevant even today.
Yeah, it really forces us to consider how societies grapple with responsibility, ethical decision-making during crises, and the consequences of rapid technological advancements. It's almost like this case study in the complexities of human nature under pressure.
It's a point worth emphasizing. This disaster wasn't just about the mechanics of a sinking. It had this ripple effect, really shaping how people viewed ocean travel. The Arctic was hailed as unsinkable, a marvel of its time. So its loss really dealt a blow to the public's faith in technological progress. It forced them to confront the power of nature and acknowledge that even the most sophisticated machines were still vulnerable.
It's interesting, isn't it? We see that same sentiment kind of arising after the Titanic sank years later. This idea that we can conquer nature with our technology, and then boom, reality checks in with a harsh reminder.
Yeah, the comparison to the Titanic is insightful. They both serve as these potent reminders of human limitations.
Yeah.
But what strikes me is how these events were perceived so differently. In the case of the Arctic, there seems to be this greater emphasis on personal accountability, perhaps reflecting the social norms of that era.
So instead of focusing solely on the technology or the shipping company, the public's attention was drawn to the choices that individuals made in those final desperate moments.
Precisely. And this is where those firsthand accounts from the newspapers become even more captivating. They offer us these glimpses into human behavior under unimaginable pressure.
You mentioned the limited communication technology of the time. It took 4.5 hours for the Arctic to sink after the collision. 4.5 hours. Can you imagine experiencing that slow-motion realization that your life might be ending?
Yeah.
One survivor, James Cagnigan, described it as this perfect mania gripping everyone.
It's a chilling description. And, those 4.5 hours really underscore the weight of individual decisions, these split-second choices that people had to make in the face of imminent danger. Some fought fiercely to secure a spot on a lifeboat, while others, like Captain Luce, made the incredibly difficult decision to stay behind.
It's a stark contrast of human responses, isn't it? And it begs the question for you listening, what would you do? Would you fight for survival, or would you prioritize others? It's easy to kind of contemplate from a distance, but when faced with such dire circumstances, who knows how any of us would truly react?
Right? These sources don't offer easy answers. They present us with this raw, messy reality of human behavior and the ethical dilemmas that inevitably arise in these crisis situations. And that's what makes them so valuable. They push us to consider the complexities of such events.
So it's not just about understanding the historical event, it's also about recognizing the echoes of those events in our own lives and the potential for similar dilemmas to arise in different forms today.
Exactly. The human experience, for all of its advancements, still faces similar challenges and choices. Now, while we're talking about the nuances within these accounts, I think it's worth highlighting some of the specific stories that are kind of buried within these pages. There are some truly remarkable details that really personalize this tragedy. Do any particular anecdotes come to mind for you?
Absolutely. I was really struck by the story of Mr. E.K. Collins, one of the owners of the Collins line. He was actually on board the Arctic with his wife, daughter, and son.
It's a heart-wrenching detail. The owner of the very company that built the ship, experiencing firsthand its devastating demise. Tragically, his wife, daughter, and son all perished in the sinking. Mr. Collins himself managed to survive by clinging to a piece of wreckage for hours before being rescued. Imagine the weight of that loss, the guilt that he must have carried.
Yeah, it really transforms the disaster from this corporate tragedy to something intensely personal. The human cost becomes undeniable.
And that speaks to the far-reaching consequences of this event. Beyond the immediate loss of life, there were families, shattered dreams, extinguished, and this lasting impact on those left behind to grapple with the aftermath.
Like those survivors who returned to New York, penniless, their livelihoods swallowed by the sea. It's a reminder that for many, the tragedy wasn't just about the loss of life, but also the loss of everything they had worked for.
And it wasn't confined to just those on board. Imagine the families waiting back home, desperately clinging to hope, while these rumors and fragmented information trickled in. The newspaper accounts that we have really depict the agonizing uncertainty of those days.
In today's world of instant communication, it's hard to fathom the pace at which news traveled back then. Weeks could pass before families received confirmation of their loved one's fate, allowing worry and despair to just fester.
It highlights this profound difference in how tragedy was experienced. The slowness of information and create this unique kind of anguish. These primary sources offer this window into that world, a world where patience and resilience were tested in ways we can hardly imagine today.
It really emphasizes the value of these firsthand accounts. They go beyond just reporting events. They capture the emotional landscape of a bygone era.
They remind us that history isn't just about understanding the past, it's about connecting with the human experiences that shaped those events. And in the case of the Arctic, it prompts us to reflect on our own relationship with technology, the choices we make, and this constant struggle to balance progress with safety and responsibility.
Now, while we've been exploring the human side of this tragedy, I'm curious to know your thoughts on the broader implications. How did this event contribute to shaping maritime safety regulations, and what lessons were learned from the chaos and loss?
Well, the Arctic disaster was really this harsh lesson in the need for stricter maritime safety regulations. As we discussed earlier, the lack of sufficient lifeboats was a glaring issue. Before this tragedy, there was no legal requirement for ships to carry enough lifeboats for all passengers and crew. I mean, imagine that setting sail across the vast ocean, knowing that if disaster struck, there might not be a place for you on a lifeboat. The public outcry after the Arctic sank led to some serious reforms, eventually making adequate lifeboat capacity a mandatory safety standard.
Yeah, it's a stark reminder that sometimes progress in safety regulations comes at a tragic cost. It's like this wake-up call that forces society to reevaluate its priorities and put measures in place to prevent similar disasters from happening again.
Exactly. And beyond the lifeboat issue, the Arctic sinking also highlighted the need for better communication at sea. The slowness with which information traveled really contributed to that delay in understanding the severity of the damage and hindered rescue efforts. This event played a role in pushing for advancements in maritime communication, ultimately leading to the development of more effective distress signals and eventually the widespread use of radio technology for ships.
So in a way, the tragic loss of the Arctic paved the way for a safer and more connected maritime world. It's a bittersweet realization, but it underscores the importance of learning from such events and using those lessons to improve safety for future generations.
You've hit the nail on the head. The Arctic serves as this case study in how tragedy can drive positive change. But beyond the tangible improvements in safety regulations and technology, the event also left this lasting mark on the public's perception of ocean travel.
Now that you mention it, the Arctic sinking does seem to have cast this long shadow, shaping the way people viewed the ocean and the inherent risks involved in transatlantic travel.
Absolutely. The Arctic was considered this pinnacle of engineering, the height of luxury and technological advancement. And its sinking really shattered that illusion of invincibility, reminding people that the sea is this powerful and unpredictable force. It forced them to confront the reality that even the most advanced machines are still vulnerable to the whims of nature and human error.
So it wasn't just about the physical loss of the ship. It was also about the loss of a sense of security and the realization that progress doesn't necessarily equate to absolute safety. It's a lesson that unfortunately has been repeated throughout history with other maritime disasters like the Titanic.
Exactly. And that's why these stories continue to fascinate and resonate with us today. They remind us of our own vulnerability and the need for humility in the face of nature's power.
As we wrap up this deep dive into the Arctic disaster, I find myself contemplating the stories of those on board, the choices they made, the lives lost, and the lives forever altered. What do you think is the most important takeaway from this exploration of history?
I think the most powerful takeaway is the reminder that history is not just this collection of dates and events, but a tapestry woven from countless individual stories. Each life lost on the Arctic had a story, a network of relationships, dreams, and aspirations. Exploring these stories allows us to connect with the human dimension of this tragedy, making it more than just a historical footnote. It allows us to reflect on our own values and how we might navigate similar challenges in our own lives.
That's a profound thought, and it brings to mind a final question for you, our listener. Imagine yourself on that foggy day in 1854, standing on the deck of the Arctic as the icy Atlantic waters rise around you. The lifeboats are gone, and the ship is sinking fast. What choices would you make in those final moments? What values would guide your actions?
It's a sobering thought experiment, but one that underscores the enduring power of history to challenge our assumptions, illuminate our values, and connect us to the shared human experience across time. Though the Arctic disaster happened over a century ago, the questions it raises about responsibility, courage, and the fragility of life remain as relevant as ever.
And on that note, we leave you to ponder those questions and to remember the human stories woven into the fabric of history. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the Arctic disaster.